Yeah, let me just think. Yeah,
Okay, we're live.
Hello.
Okay. All right.
How do we do the intro thing again? I've never hosted a stream before, but this is David Medvite, the guy who owns the channel. I got not this guy, this guy. I got my friend Lewis and Ubi, and we're gonna be talking about the papacy. Lewis is streaming for us, so thank you, Lewis, for streaming this. The topic is going to be about the Orthodox view of the papacy. And before we get on the topic, I just kind of want Ubi to introduce himself. So, Ubi, who are you and why do you matter? Let's start with that. Hello?
Oh, you're breaking
Okay.
up. It's really slow.
Oh, really?
Should be fine. I think the lag's on your end.
Yeah, it might be.
Go somewhere with better internet. Use your like unlimited data or whatever. Make yourself a Wi-Fi hotspot.
Oh, me?
Nah, Ubi.
Ah. Or maybe we can go to Skype. Maybe. Yeah?
Might be better to go to Skype.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can. I haven't tested that out yet, so.
All right, we'll just go to Skype then.
But I haven't
perhaps
tested
now
that out.
it's a
I
little
don't know
bit
if that'll
better.
work. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
hear him, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I go by Ubi, and I am one of several people who is part of the group Ubi Petrus. We are a group who focuses on basically defending the Orthodox positions via history, theology, and linguistics. I was a Roman Catholic for about the first half of my life, and I am now Eastern Orthodox. I have been for about 20 years now.
And for those who aren't aware, you also have a YouTube channel, right?
Yes, but it has merely one video on it at this point.
Yeah, the video on Eric Ibarra and his mistakes on which was a very good video. And I love the debate challenge at the end of the video because you gave him like crazy advantageous conditions and he still refuses to debate you in spite of like all the kind of advantages that he can have while debating. So that to me is very funny. But to get back on topic, this stream, what I'm planning on doing in this stream is essentially this. We have seen enough anti-Vatican I apologetics against the papacy, right? We have seen a lot of like counter-papal Orthodox positions, but I feel like what we're kind of missing is this kind of positive apologetics, some kind of description of how the Orthodox view the papacy and like what we understand from it. So less about what it isn't, but more about what it is. So what I want to kind of start by is we know the Vatican I Roman Catholic view of the papacy, or basically the Pope was always the supreme pontiff, or some of them say it's a development, whatever. But there's also this position that I want to ask about that's kind of prevalent in some circles, and it's this kind of position where, well, okay, but we look at certain statements from the fathers, and they seem to speak of some primacy, and I think the whole thing is how do we understand that primacy? So some people have this understanding that this papal primacy is some kind of nominal, vague honor kind of thing, and is that how we should view papal primacy? It's just some nominal honor that the Bishop of Rome just somehow has, or is it something more than that? What would you say?
Well, first we should think about what honor was in the ancient world. In an era where there was very little law and order, or it was very much localized to spots, honor functioned sort of like your credit score. But it was your credit score in terms of who was willing to disagree with you, who was willing to fight you, who was willing to attempt to intrude in on your territory. The more honor you had, the less likely others were willing to intrude in on your territory or disagree with you or whatnot. The less honor you had, the more they were willing to intrude. And so statements like primacy of honor have to be understood in that sense. And that is something that people who live in the West in the 20th and 21st centuries do not understand. So with the Pope, he was the head of the Synod of the world. He functioned to the world the same way that an archbishop functions in his synod, or a patriarch functions within his synod. He's not the only voice, but he's not just one other voice. He has a certain degree of what the Romans called auctoritas, which means authority, but it means authority. Well, it means a variety of things, but one way that it can be translated into English is authority in the sense of like a leading authority in their field, or someone who has more, their reputation is very good. It doubles in meaning to mean other things like a witness or authorization. But the Pope was able to, I mean, as head of the Synod, he had the same rights over the patriarchs that the patriarch has over his synod. And this is something that you don't really notice if you're following materials that's produced by a lot of the evangelical converts to Orthodoxy. And unfortunately, some of the Catholic converts too fall into this. They start to think like, well, the council, the Pope. Well, the council involves the Pope, involves the Patriarch of Antioch. So it's not really clear how, I mean, if you don't have that concept of a head of a synod and then members of a synod and how they come to agreements, the council just becomes a sort of vague body that it's nebulous. It's not really clear what it is, what constitutes the council. But we know from ecumenical councils exactly what constitutes a valid council. And we have a Florilegium, or a collection of patristic quotes, on that on the Ubi Petrus blog. And we'll have a second one coming out soon. And it's very clear what it was to the church fathers. It was the main bishops are in unison, and then an overwhelming majority. At the Second Council of Nicaea, it was pointed out that the Council of Hieria in 754, it was an iconoclast council, it was invalid because it did not involve the Pope, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarchs of Antioch, Alexandria, nor Jerusalem. It did not have any of those. So therefore, the Second Council of Nicaea said, Hieria was not a real council. It was not an ecumenical council. Having stated that, there are situations in which the Pope can be overruled, such as if he's in heresy, the other patriarchs can excommunicate him. We saw this at the Council of Constantinople II in 553, when the bishops there excommunicated, or I should say perhaps suspended from office, Pope Vigilius, until Vigilius turned around and repented. And Vigilius' successor signed off on those acts. So there was nothing in the Roman mind at that time that stated a council could not depose a pope. If you look at the current situation within the Roman Catholic Church, specifically from the Gregorian reforms on, but very clearly from the time of the Council of Basel in the 15th century, and then absolutely without a doubt by Vatican I, you can have no such situation. as you saw at the Second Council of Constantinople. It is absolutely heretical in their eyes.
So another thing that I had on my mind that I wanted to ask, and this is something that I was kind of thinking of, will it be accurate then to say that, let's say you lived in the 6th century or the 7th century and you were in communion with Rome, but you lived in the East, and someone asked you, look, what is the church you're talking about? What is the center of the church or anything of that sort? And you say, in what sense do you mean? And he said, well, in some kind of material sense, like, what church will you point out to and say, this is not the church, but rather this is like the center or something like that? And I kind of had in mind, well, if that was a question, will it be accurate to point out to them and say, well, we will say this? Doesn't mean that any other church is a lesser church, unlike what Vatican I says, but that, it's when we talk of the church and the center of it on earth, Rome comes to mind. Will that be accurate or will that be inaccurate?
Well, it depends on who they were trying to butter up and who they were trying to get on their side. In order to understand how the Byzantines or any Eastern culture speaks, you have to understand that flattery is very, very, very normal in those cultures. Now, I just finished reading the Acts of the Council of Ephesus. It came out. Father Richard Price, a Catholic priest, translated it and gave a commentary with it. And one of the letters of John of Antioch, perhaps I should rewind a touch. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, John of Antioch is the Patriarch of Antioch, and he's coming, and he ends up arriving to the council late. But he sends messengers ahead who, according to St. Cyril of Alexandria, said, do what you have to do, continue on with the proceedings. And Cyril, he assumes that this is a hint, because he knows that John of Antioch is friends with Nestorius, and he assumes that John does not want to deal with the very embarrassing fact that he will have to condemn his friend. And so Cyril goes ahead and he runs the council. He tricks the imperial official into reading the Sacra, the imperial Sacra, which officially opens the council, and deposes Nestorius. Then has his, prior to that, they examine documents and so forth and so on, but they depose Nestorius. Now, John of Antioch arrives about 2.5 weeks later, finds out what has gone on, and excommunicates Cyril, Memnon of Ephesus, and all the bishops who side with them. And he writes this letter. I don't recall who it's to. I think it's to the emperor. But John says that Cyril has separated himself from the church. He says that Memnon and the bishops present have separated themselves from the church. So for John, he's a Patriarch of Antioch, and he has like 30 or 40 bishops. The signatures are fairly different depending on the manuscript. Some say as many as 60, some say as few as 30. They view themselves as the church. And they're saying, well, Rome and Jerusalem and Alexandria, and they've just, they've broken away from Constantinople and Antioch. That's how they looked at it. You see in the Acacian Schism, from 484 to, depending on where you were in the East. Well, that was when Constantinople signed onto the Libellus of Hormisdas, but over the decades, the other patriarchates didn't actually sign it. They just sort of entered into independent agreements. But those bishops did not see themselves as out of the church. They saw themselves as out of communion with Rome, but not the church. Yeah. And if you don't believe me, go read the letters. They had no issue back then in excommunicating a pope or removing his name from the diptycha. So was it the center of the church to them? If they really needed help, you could see language like that. But when it came down to it, and actions speak louder than words, no, they did not think so. They believed the center of the church was whoever held the truth.
Right, and another question that I want to kind of get at is that, which, by the that whole Achaean schism thing is a story in and of itself, because so many things went on. Is there a I kind of want to connect this to Canon 28 of Chalcedon, but before I connect to that, is there a case, like for example, we can talk of Council of Sardica, where Rome has something that the other bishops don't have? Is that Are those canons describing what Rome always had, or are those councils basically saying, okay, from now on Rome officially has those powers, or whatever those powers are? Can you expand a bit more on that?
At the Council of Sardica, it was discussed that you could make various appeals to the city or to the Bishop of Rome if you were a deposed cleric, and that the Pope could order your case to be reviewed. The Pope would not hear your case directly, although it morphed into that in an attempt to copy the 9th and I believe it was 17th canons of Chalcedon. But he could order, he would review your case and decide whether or not your case could actually receive an appeal, which was a case that would take almost as long as hearing the case itself. We know that cases then, for example, we know the Dioscorus of Alexandria in the Acts of Chalcedon, his trial takes less than a day. And he was the second highest ranked patriarch in the eye, well, supposedly, in the eyes of Rome. Realistically, he was the third. But the council, at the end of those canons, it says the council grants it, or the council agrees to this. And we knew that these appeals had been going on for a while in some case or another, but we also know that appeals to Constantinople were going on very early on. In fact, in the video we did against Ibarra, we cite a number of those. And so is it a matter of the council recognizing the situation, or of the council giving validity and granting validity to it? The answer is, in the case of Sardica, it was a case of the council granting validity, because when Athanasius was restored to his see by Rome, Eastern prelates said, no, you cannot do that. You cannot do that at all. And so everyone then had to get together and say, well, no, actually he can. So if it was simply a matter of recognizing that the Pope could do that, they would not have said the council grants it.
Yeah. So then this connects to the next question. If a council can grant validity of certain powers, let's say, can it also grant, more than that? Can we, let's say, grant primacy or something like that? Is
What
it
do you
possible
mean
for
by
a council to do?
What do you mean by primacy?
Well, in this specific case, let's say, I'm taking like post-schism here. Like, can it like grant, let's say, the prime church left, so maybe we should talk about this. Who should be like, should there be someone replacing that primacy? Should there not be, right? Can a council do that? Is it possible? Because there's some debates going on, in at least in some circles, regarding that, from what I've understood.
So are you referring to the Patriarch of Constantinople taking the leading role
You could say that, yeah.
post-schism?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we are technically, we see the See of Rome. We are still in communion with the See of Rome. We just see it as empty. You'll notice that we have the way that the Orthodox patriarchs interact with the Pope is pretty much the same way they interact with any of the Oriental patriarchs. And we don't see them as valid either. So the idea that, they would, I think, people will say like, well, the Patriarch of Russia, he wrote the introduction to a book by Pope Francis. It's like, okay, and so I mean, did he enter him into the diptycha? No.
No.
If he were a valid pope, he would be entered into the diptycha. I mean, I guess you could say we see them as anti-popes currently. So, I mean, a council can change the order of the bishops. And Leo, Pope St. Leo, he writes against this regularly. He goes, no, they can't. But then from Pope Nicholas on to the present day, the Church of Rome has a completely different view, where they actually accord Constantinople second place. So it looks like Leo was wrong.
And
either that or the Pope St. Nicholas were wrong.
Yeah. And speaking of Pope St. Leo Chalcedon, about Canon 28, confirm this if I'm wrong or like correct, but like the way I see it and the way I've argued is basically that the primacy that Constantinople got in the east, which you can trace it back to 381, Constantinople 1, the primacy that Constantinople got on the east is actually based on Roman primacy. Will that be correct to say that it's basically whatever the primacy Rome has, Constantinople has that primacy on the east in some sense?
You could say so. It states that they have primacy after Rome. So yes, you could say they have it in the east. I mean, that's what the canons 9 and 17 of Chalcedon say.
Yeah. So
or imply.
Yeah. Will that? Hold up. There's a fly over here. But will that also then? Actually, hold off on that line of thought. But I think if you're going to be talking about like the topic of the papacy, I think that also kind of implies epistemology in some sense. Like, how do we know what is true? And so you see this kind of basic question from Roman Catholics that I have made videos against it, and I kind of want your thoughts on it since you made the Florilegium on it. If let's say Roman Catholic says this, let's say, okay, look, there is this council, Second Council of Ephesus. I'm going to go with that example. How do we know? How do you guys know, right? So you don't believe in the papacy. So how do you guys know that Ephesus 2 is a false council and Chalcedon is the right council? How can you make that judgment? In what ways? And this can go for Hieraria, Council of Hieraria that you mentioned, or any other robber council that got rejected. How do we know that they are not true councils? By what metric do we use?
For one, Leo annulled it. His representatives annulled it, and then he ratified their annulling. 2, the Patriarch of Constantinople did not accept it, nor did the Patriarch of Antioch. In fact, those 2 were invited to the council, and then out of the blue, it turned into a trial of theirs. They were not called there for trial, which would be a different situation entirely. At Ephesus 1, Nestorius was called there for a trial. At Chalcedon, Dioscorus was called there for a trial. At Constantinople 2, the Pope was called there and told, this is what's going on. He would not even show up to what was going to be a trial, so they suspended him. In the case of Ephesus 2, Domnus of Antioch and St. Flavian of Constantinople were called there, and then just out of the blue, they're just deposed. And Flavian is beaten to death, or beaten so badly he dies shortly thereafter by that idiot Dioscorus, and his lackeys. But so, Dioscorus then installs a Patriarch of Constantinople, Anatolius. He then installs a Patriarch of Antioch, Maximus. And by the way, Leo goes into communion with Maximus immediately, no questions asked, which means that he accepted the right of Dioscorus to depose Domnus. It's not until much later that Domnus accepts says, I just want to retire to a monastery, leave me alone. And there's a sort of embarrassing moment in the Acts revolving around that later on. But it was Ephesus 2 was accepted only by 2 patriarchs. And it was rejected, moreover, by a very large portion of the bishops. It's not simply a matter of, the patriarchs accept it. It has to be an overwhelming majority of the other bishops. And the reason for that is the bishops typically voted in blocks. This is why it's so embarrassing at Chalcedon when the bishops from Illyria start criticizing the tome. They were under Rome, and Rome produced the tome. So why are they criticizing it? Well, it means they had some very strong objections. So I mean, here's
yeah.
Oh, sorry, no, you first. So, for example,
I think there's a bit of a lag. That's why we had that moment. But
there is.
I was just gonna comment on, like, that's not only is, like, aside from the embarrassment, which it is, but it's really fascinating because in a way, it also helps Rome because it gave them an opportunity for the council to look at the tome and say, actually, this tome is actually indeed orthodox, because, you know, alternatively, it will have gone without question. That will have raised some questions from the anti-Chalcedonian side. And I think it is an embarrassment, but it actually produced an even better opportunity. And that, you know, Illyria opposing, which is under Rome, also obviously states that even their own bishops can oppose Rome itself and say, there's something going on there, I can't really accept it during a council, which I think is, like, it really hammers home that Rome having primacy isn't, like, super mega duper special like Vatican I says there. But, you know, go on with the point that you were.
Oh, you hear all the time from Catholic apologists. For example, the Diamond Brothers. I should say, well, Most Holy Family Monastery, which is really a trailer stary, but they make this video called The Fatal Flaws of Eastern Orthodoxy. Oh, no, I mean, have you seen pictures of it? I mean, it looks like they sit around all day drinking Coors Light. But they make this video called The Fatal Flaws of Eastern Orthodoxy on Councils, or something along those lines. And they try to argue that Florence is indeed a valid ecumenical council for us. And I see Catholic apologists argue this constantly, or else see people say, well, Orthodoxy can have no unity because all it took was one bishop disagreeing and it was all out the window. Well, no, because that one bishop who was there, Saint Mark of Ephesus, he was not just a bishop, he was actually the representative of the Patriarch of Alexandria. And then he was switched to be the representative of Antioch, and they switched him back and forth around a few times. He said no. Further, the Serbs, they had their own patriarchate at the time. They never even showed up. They ignored the invitation, and the Georgians, who had their own patriarchate at that time, they left before the vote was even taken. They were actually they snuck out of the city because the Pope didn't want them to leave. I mean, they quite literally like tied bed sheets together and climbed out the window. I mean, how do you get old people out the window that way? I mean, can you imagine some 75-year-old trying to climb out the window?
I made a stream with this on Jade months ago, and I read this from the Council of Florence book by Ivan Ostromov, which is translated by Basil Popov. And like he talks about like the Pope will what the Pope will do is that he said, okay, I'm gonna pay for you guys, so you don't have to worry about like not having food or anything. And then like every single time the council wasn't going the Pope's way, the Pope will just, oh look, okay, I'm gonna pay you later. Basically saying, look, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm not gonna pay you. I'm gonna like keep you starving. And that's one of the motivations that made Georgians say, look, man, if you stay here, we're gonna die. So let's just run away, and it had to run away from it. Yeah, like the Pope did. Like obviously they've been paid by the Pope. Saint Mark of Ephesus was, had to deal with that. And I also want to add, which maybe you were going to add as well, but just a couple months later,
practical people. So yes,
after a couple of months, the Eastern Patriarchs condemned Florence. Right? Hello? I guess he cut off again. Oh. Oh, you're back, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's catching up. Could you guys hear me eating? Like I had my mic on mute, but
No, no, no. We can't hear you eat. You can keep on
I mean
gobbling.
before. Like I muted myself now,
Oh
but
yeah, yeah, yeah. We can see the camera, but you were the I think it was muted.
oh, you couldn't hear anything. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I just wanted to make sure you couldn't hear my like crunching,
Mm-hmm.
because someone was saying crunch, crunch, crunch in chat, but I was pretty
Yeah.
sure my mic was muted.
Yeah. While Ubi is fixing, I guess I also wanted to say this. You guys can ask questions in the comments. I'm not logged in.
Did I cut out for a moment?
Oh, okay. Tell us when you're ready. We're gonna What I was gonna say though is people in the comment section, they can ask questions. Maybe should we have a Q&A when we're about done, Luz? Yeah. Yeah. So we can have a Q&A. People can ask.
All right, Lewis, can you hear me okay?
I can
Yeah,
hear you.
we can hear you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So
Okay.
we were.
Did David
yeah,
cut out?
No, no, no. Can you hear me? I don't think you can.
There's a lag. There's a delay.
Yeah, there's a heavy delay. That's what happens when you're on village internet. At least I am. I'm on
No,
village
it's
internet.
Ubi's. We're fine because we can talk.
Okay.
It's on his end.
All right. It was fine for most of the stream, but
It was, yeah. It was kind of fluctuating.
mm-hmm.
Just Ubi, just say 1, 2, 3, 4 when you hear me.
Yeah. The comment. Maybe.
All right. Are we back?
Yeah, I can hear
Hello?
you. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Okay. Yes,
All
I can
right.
hear you okay.
There we go. Let's go.
All right. Good. 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 All right. So it was on Florence, and I commented on Eastern Patriarchs rejecting Florence after the council. Did you catch that part?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I did miss that part. Could you say that again, please?
Yeah, I was saying that, like you were talking about St. Mark of Ephesus being a representative of Alexandria, and I mentioned, according to the book written by Ivan Ostromov, I remember reading that after a couple months after the council, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria had a council and rejected Florence a couple months later, right?
The manuscripts are not clear. It might have been a couple months, might have been a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, the union was actually hidden from almost everyone. And there were suspicions, but it took several years before the union was actually publicly proclaimed.
I see.
Mm-hmm. And so realistically, the only patriarchate to have accepted Florence was Constantinople. And it was not even the patriarch who was at Florence. He actually died before it was signed. And then they find this letter that is written in Latin where he, apparently gives a confession. I mean, not very good at forgers, but it was his successor that signed on to it. And he would not publicly proclaim. It was rumors that spread throughout the city saying that they had actually signed on to the union and that it was the government's official policy. And then when it came out that it was the official policy, yes, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria then formally repudiated it. But you also have the fact that Alexandria had never accepted it because of their two representatives. One was Mark of Ephesus, although I can't remember if at that point they'd switched him to being the representative of Antioch, but they moved him around quite a bit. And then Serbia and Georgia had never accepted it.
Yeah.
And also the fact that the Pope then at the end of it, when they ask him, everyone is signed except Mark, the Pope himself says, then we have accomplished nothing. So, I mean, from the mouth of the Pope himself, it was not binding.
And to my knowledge, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you need anonymity. I can't speak English, but you need everyone agreeing on it. Even if one person doesn't agree, it's kind of like nothing. Isn't that correct? Like everyone has to agree in a council to like pass something.
Well, they will say unanimous, but it's a unanimous vote among the major bishops,
Okay.
and then an overwhelming majority among the rest. And there's this interesting point where you see this. If you read, Sozomen, the historian,
Mhm.
he writes about the Council of Nicaea, and he recounts several letters from the Emperor St. Constantine, and then from Eusebius of Caesarea about the aftermath of the council. And they're writing out, Constantine and Eusebius, to respective churches, talking about what went on. And in one of those letters, they talk about how there was a unanimous vote, except for a couple bishops who didn't really agree, but it was unanimous. So their concept of unanimous was not the same as ours.
Yeah.
Their concept was overwhelming majority. And you find this also in the Acts of Ephesus. Cyril's main defense of why his council was correct and John of Antioch's was not was, well, we have way more people and we all agreed.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it, that is his defense.
Mm-hmm. But would you say
when
that,
you read the
go on. Mm-hmm.
No, you first. When you read the Council of Chalcedon, there's this one point where they talk about the Egyptian bishops, who just don't really want to agree. They want to hold off. And one bishop goes, he goes, are we going to listen to them or are we going to listen to 1,200 bishops, which was supposedly the number of bishops in the empire? So there again, you have that reasoning. But it's fine-tuned, and I shouldn't say fine-tuned, when it really comes down to it, when they want to say something was not valid, they will always point out that there was the decisions of one of the major sees of Christendom. The decision was not passed by one of those.
So it seems to me then what goes on then is that a lot of these arguments, they kind of, there's preliminary arguments and then time kind of like settles these things, right? So we wouldn't say that, for example, numbers, some Roman Catholics had a kind of understanding where like, Orthodox belief is just numbers, right? If you have the numbers, that's a true counsel for them or whatever. Not really, but that is an argument that gets occasionally used to kind of point out, look, these people have a wrong counsel, ours is more correct. But what I'm getting at, will it be accurate then to state that ultimately it's kind of how the church receives the counsel that can like settle these things, and it could be pertinent even about today, right? I mean, right now we have certain issues in the church, and it's kind of time that's gonna solidify it. Right now we're kind of in the fighting stage, if you kind of catch my drift.
So if you are talking about the Council of Crete in 2016, is that the one you're thinking of?
It could be one of those things, yeah. I'm more so referring like the canonical status of Ukraine can also be included, right? Basically stuff that's happening today.
Well, canonical statuses are always a mess to sort out. It took Georgia, so Antioch granted it autocephaly in the 5th century. It was not recognized by the other patriarchates until the early 11th century. That's a long time.
That's a pretty long time, yeah.
Yeah. Likewise, look at the situation involving Bulgaria. And if the Catholics were correct that the Pope could just sort of, step in and call the shots, I'm the Pope, I have the tallest hat, get out of my way. Why was there such a mess in sorting out the jurisdiction over Bulgaria?
Yeah.
As Bulgaria flip-flopped and then eventually got its own church. Look at the way that, say, the Ecumenical Patriarchate granted and then rescinded and then granted again autocephaly to Bulgaria, to Romania, to Serbia, the list goes on and on. So it's always a messy affair.
Yeah.
The only time that it was really clean was the autocephaly of Moscow in 1666, in which case the Tsar essentially had the patriarchs and or their representatives there, and they said, we have a bunch of donations for you bankrupt Greeks. We're autocephalous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Greeks went, yeah, sure. Can we have the donations? That's how it was. There's also the fact that it was just it was too much work to get someone up to Moscow from the Ottoman Empire, and to keep communication. So it was a lot easier if they were simply independent, how they were running. It was a lot easier to micromanage Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania than it was something as vast and as far away as Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of councils, typically it's very shortly after that they are accepted. A notable exception is the Council of Constantinople in 381. It was not formally accepted in the West until, well, at Chalcedon, you see them mention it as an ecumenical council, and the legates sign on. But among the popes, I mean, I think it's in the 6th century, mid-6th century, they accepted it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nicaea is another example, although like Persia seems to accept it 80 years after 325. Like they accepted in the 5th century, to my knowledge.
Yeah, they're kind of the Persian church is one of those things that they were just off on their own. They were part of it had to do with the massive amount of persecution they were going through.
Mm-hmm.
The other part had to do with the fact that Persians just tend to do things off on their own. They've always been that way. They are their own culture, their own civilization, and they prefer to keep it that way. But in the case of, say, Constantinople II in 553, there was a schism in the West over the acceptance of this.
Yeah.
And it's Pope St. Gregory the Great, who died in 604. He ruled from 590 to 604. He defends it, and he defends it with the numbers argument. Everyone's agreed to it, therefore I agree to it.
Yeah.
And you have like Second Nicaea, which you think would be the slam dunk. It's really hit and miss whether or not it is accepted. You have people like St. Theodore the Studite, who up in the 800s, because Second Nicaea was in 787, up into the, you could say, not quite early, not quite mid 800s, he's not considering it an ecumenical council, and it had been ratified by all of the patriarchates. The Franks were absolutely vehement because of some mistranslations that they would not accept it under any circumstances. And then eventually they did. The Pope was like, come now, you can accept this. If it's good enough for Italians, it's good enough for the Franks, And he smoothed it over, and the Franks accepted it.
So it seems like let's take the example of that period right after Nicaea II and 800s. You will say that the churches that accepted it was becoming the norm. Universally speaking, it will kind of be wrong to say it was 100% like ratified at that stage, because there were still churches in communion that didn't accept it, or they were opposing it, or maybe they were ambiguous about it. They weren't really sure what to think of the council. Will that kind of like explain how we eventually end up like having dogmas over time? Like it just ends up naturally just kind of becomes dogma. We can't really pinpoint when, but we can understand when it is and when it isn't, kind of a way, because that's how I think of Chalcedon, for example.
So when you sign on to a council, it's as obligatory upon you.
Yeah.
And when you get, the head of the synod and the major bishops within that synod agreeing, and you're like one of a few people who do not agree, well,
Mm-hmm.
there's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Why is it so many people saw this and you did not?
Yeah.
But typically it's I mean, once it's ratified by the various patriarchates, I mean, it's dogma. I mean, I should say that, Saint Theodore the Studite, he was sort of a contentious figure who his issues for rejecting it had a lot more to do with a personal issue with Tarasios, Saint Tarasios, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and it had to do with a well, that's another story, but
Okay. Actually, does that have maybe it might be interesting. So what was he contentious about?
I'd have to look up the dates again, but I believe it was about a marriage. It was a remarriage issue. But the Studites were fairly strict about. Well, I should say, it actually ties into issues that end up blowing up during the Photian Schism, and it had to do with remarriage when a spouse was alive, and
Okay.
yeah, it's a whole nother thing, and I'd have to review the dates.
And now that you mentioned Saint Photius, we gotta also cover the Eighth Ecumenical Council, as I like to call it. Yeah, ninth century disputes and whatnot. So give us because this is another thing Roman Catholics or ortho-curious people kind of want to know how we view the papacy, want to understand, and like how we understand epistemology and all that kind of stuff. It seems like, in the 9th century, for those who don't know, there were two councils. There was the Eighth Ecumenical Council for the Roman Catholics today in 869, if I had the dates correctly.
That's correct.
And then there is a council 10 years after that we refer to as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. It's an Eighth Ecumenical Council for us Orthodox, which happened in 879. And that's the Photian Council. So what really went down in those councils? How do we know that Council 861 was just false and the Council 879 was the true council? How do we know that?
Well, first, the Council of 879 annulled the one of 869, and the Western Church accepted the Council of 879 until the 11th century, when they suddenly needed the canons from the Council of 869 in regards to simony. So they actually reneged and went back on their word after agreeing that it was a council that was annulled. So that's how we know it was a fake council. Or I shouldn't say fake council, it was an annulled council. And it had to do with the Patriarch Saint Ignatius and whether or not his resignation had been valid. And the Pope Saint Nicholas, I'm sorry, not Saint Nicholas, the Pope Nicholas, he's a saint for the Roman Catholics, not for us. He sent over legates because he heard that Photius had become the patriarch, and the letter that the emperor had written to the Pope tried to really sugarcoat it, and Nicholas could tell something was not quite right. So he demands that he send people over to research it. And according to Francis Dvornik, Father Francis Dvornik was a Catholic priest. He wrote The Photian Schism. It's a great book. It's the authoritative work on it, along with Meyer's book. According to Dvornik, canonically, the Byzantines did not have to let Nicholas review the case. But they realized that it would be more convenient if they just, all right, sure, you can, take a look. And you have this council in what was it, 861 or 860, I can't remember when it was, but the legates go, okay, all right, looks good. And they receive a bunch of gifts. They go back to Rome, and Nicholas goes, absolutely not, no. And punishes the two legates And it just starts a spiral where Photius and a bunch of bishops in the East excommunicate the Pope, and the Pope excommunicates them, and then it builds up, and then you have the Council of 869, where Photius refuses to talk, even when he's on trial. And I believe he's exiled. And then Ignatius and him end up making up, and he's made patriarch again. And then 879, they go, well, we should really patch things up with Rome. Now, keep in mind, and this is an interesting point, right? St. Photius was excommunicated by Rome, but all the other bishops who were in communion with Rome were in communion with St. Photius, or most of them. So you see the same thing with the schism of Meletios of Antioch, right? That you have people who are in communion with Rome and in communion with Meletios, but Meletios is not in communion with Rome.
Yeah.
Well, you have the same thing, right? You have people in communion with Photius and Rome, but Rome and Photius are not in communion.
And if I was to connect both today and the past, I can add Antioch and Alexandria in 431, 433 were not in communion with each other, but they're in communion with the rest of the church. And we can add in today, Russia and Constantinople aren't in communion, but Moscow and Constantinople more so, but they're in communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church. So kind of wants to mention that because a lot of people bring that up and say, oh, this proves why the Orthodox are wrong, when this is pre-schism. This has happened pre-schism multiple times, right?
Yeah, it's I mean, things were not cut and dry then, they are not cut and dry now. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the fallout after the First Council of Ephesus. Yeah, you had Akakios of Beroia, which is modern-day Aleppo, or what's left of Aleppo, and he was in communion with everyone, despite Rome and Antioch not being in communion, Alexandria and Antioch not being in communion. In fact, Akakios was, or Acacius of Aleppo, he was chosen to smooth things out precisely because he was in communion with everyone.
And he was pretty old at the time, so he was an elder, basically seen as this elder figure that people could rely on, at least, right?
Yeah, he was really old. They called him the old man of the East. And there's a letter or exchange between him and Cyril, in which Cyril tries to get him on his side, and Acacius basically tells Cyril, just drop it. Just let it be. I don't want to have to deal with this right now. And so, I mean, he was so old that he just didn't even care about anything. And Nestorius was a raging heretic. I mean, you read his letters. There is no way you can read his letters and be like, oh, I think he was misunderstood. No, he was not. He was absolutely not. I mean, this is like, I mean, reading Nestorius' letters and saying he was misunderstood is like reading Mein Kampf and being like, I think Hitler was misunderstood. It's like, no, he was not. Right? It was very clear, and we know he was very clear what he intended because of what he did later. So that's that.
Sometimes you need people like that to solve these things. Yeah, like
just really crazy people. Like,
no, like Acacius, like, like he looks at an idiot like Nestorius. He's like, yeah, I know, or like maybe he just like ignores it and like, look, yes, maybe he is crazy. I don't care. Like, we kind of sometimes need that kind of an elderly figure that, because he kind of like smooth things out. But that's a different kind of topic.
Yeah.
To get back on Saint Photius and the 9th century, like to go back on that. So that all that stuff happened.
If I could just say, I think Akakios, I think John of Antioch was a much better person to try and solve it. There's a letter that he writes to Nestorius, because what happens is Rome sends out its decision, and it sends it to Alexandria, but it sends copies that are to be sent to all these different bishops to Alexandria and tells Alexandria to disperse them. Well, it gets to Antioch, and John of Antioch he's doing an ordination. There's a bunch of bishops with him, consecration of a bishop. And he then immediately writes this letter to Nestorius saying, look, I got the verdict from Rome and from Alexandria. You really, really, really need to back down now.
Mm-hmm.
And this letter gets to Nestorius long before the Alexandrian party gets to Nestorius. Several weeks, probably. And in it, John of Antioch says something to the extent of, on this title, Theotokos, many venerable men have used it before you, and they are giving you 10 days to make a decision. But if you were reasonable, you would not even need 24 hours, is essentially what he says. And you start to understand that Nestorius is this sort of clueless, bull-headed person who just really does not understand theology. He's very vain, and he was the absolute worst person for the job. But those type of people thrive in a situation where there's someone who's really old and tired who just will not deal with them. Yeah. And so, as far as I can see, John of Antioch was starting to fill the shoes of Akakios of Aleppo. Akakios, I mean, he had been in the sunset of his life for 20, 30 years. I mean, he was beyond waiting to die. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was hoping to die, probably, is how old he was.
Please, just let me go. Like,
yeah, I mean, this is...
Just let me go.
Yeah, I mean, this is in the days before walkers and wheelchairs. I mean, he was ancient. So, anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, let's get back on the 9th century St. Photius stuff, because we left that in like halfway before 869. So what happened at 869? What happened at the Ignatian Council?
St. Photius refused to speak. They brought him into the area, and they would, ask him questions, and they bring out Ignatius. Now here's a problem with this. There's this back and forth about what exactly occurred, and there's different versions of it from different people. So, for example, some of the partisans of Ignatius claimed that they had appealed to Rome. Now, they bring Ignatius out, and they ask him this, and he goes, I didn't appeal. And Ignatius, by the way, St. Ignatius is another one of these people who they're just sort of socially inept. They're not
so much like me.
I have you beat there. I'm far more socially inept, but perhaps that's why we get along. But he doesn't really understand, when to just stay quiet and let things work themselves out. In fact, he's semi-hostile towards the Roman legates who come there to defend him. He's rude to them. He's extremely rude. In the way he sort of is somewhat smug towards them and has this attitude of, I don't need you. And it's like, buddy, you've been in prison for a while. You need them badly. And Photius is much more of a statesman. He's much more sly. Intellectually, he could run circles around Ignatius. I mean, St. Photius, he could be 3 sheets to the wind. And he could intellectually still outweigh St. Ignatius, who was a very, very pious man, very holy man. If you read his life by Nikitas David, he was a very, very holy man. But he just, he was not a thinker. And that was one of the reasons why the strict party really, really liked him. They thought he was this, excellent person. St. Photius really represented the upper class of Byzantine society, the educated types, the people who were in the theological know-how. So.
Yeah. So in terms of, that's kind of like what happened in 869, and what did 870, so like my question here is basically kind of a basic question. 869, the council at 869, Ignatian Council, and the Photian Council 10 years later, how do we know which one is true? By what judgment? We mentioned well, at 879 annulled it, and the Pope accepted it, right? And so if the papacy, what I'm getting at here is that if the papacy, then it says 3 centuries later, oh, it turns out actually, I annulled the annulment or whatever. Is that a valid thing for them to do? Like, can they do that? Is that something they are allowed to do or they can do? Or is that absolutely wrong and unacceptable for them to 3 centuries later say, we never accepted 879 in the first place, or we annul it today, we don't accept it anymore, right? Can they even do such a thing? Or
No. I mean, imagine that you sign a legal contract and now you're like, well, I just didn't sign it. Well, no.
I didn't sign it 20 years
you signed
ago.
it.
I'm not.
Yeah,
You still like imagine you're trying to pay the student loans. 10 years later, you're like, the 10 years ago, me 10 years ago, I'm not the same person. I'm not.
yeah,
That's not me.
yeah.
It's kind of
I've
like
turned
that, right?
over. Yeah, it's like that. I mean, you can't. I mean, look at it this way: if they could simply annul something they had decided upon, why not annul Nicaea?
Yeah, right. That's a big objection, definitely. Like if you can annul what I'm kind of getting at here is that you can kind of annul or like go back on like 869, right? Rome accepted 869, but then 10 years later they accepted the council that kind of said no, actually we don't accept it anymore. So Rome went back on that. So you can't do that because it's a short time frame. But like 3 centuries, that's a bit too long, isn't it? Like you can't do that after that long, and especially after the big parties, the relevant parties came together and already solved the issue. I think that's what's really pertinent here is that 879 solved these issues, did it not?
Um, it, it's not quite that simple. It's more so that the first council in 869, it had to do with an issue of discipline, and the conditions at the council of 869 were met later on. That was one of the ways that they were able to agree to the council of 879. Saints Photius and Ignatius, they made up, they got together, and they got along. But there were some issues at the 879 council about not adding to the creed. The best book on that is by Meyer, but that book is out of print. If you email me, I can send you a PDF copy of it, but it's really like a horrible. It looks like it was photocopied and from there just run through a scanner.
There's an article that Jay will post about the Eighth Ecumenical Council, though. It's called it's on Lewis, can you post it? I'll post it in private chat because I'm not logged in, but can you post this in chat? It's from Father George Dionysius Dragas, and he kind of talks about the filioque side, how the Eighth Ecumenical Council rejects the filioque and all and that kind of stuff. Yeah, thanks. So what was I getting at? But yeah, there's also that side. The how does filioque tie into it exactly? Like, why was it relevant at the time? Why then?
I'm sorry, you cut out quite a bit. Could you repeat that, please?
Can you explain more the filioque side? Like, how did that even become relevant? Wasn't this about Saint Nicholas? Not Saint Nicholas. I already forgot their names. But
Ignatius.
Saint Ignatius and Saint Photius, right? How did it become relevant? Wasn't it something like it seems like it just kind of sprung out of nowhere? Can you give a context on that? Why it came up?
Why the filioque did, or why it came up at that council?
At that time, yeah. Why the filioque came up at that time?
So the issue of the filioque had been sort of bouncing around, and it first came to the attention of the Greeks in the 600s. You have that letter of St. Maximus to Marinus. in which he describes what's sort of a hypostatic versus an energetic procession of the Spirit from the Father, and then hypostatic from the Father, and then energetic from the Son. And it just sort of sits there for a while. But because St. Photius is involved with missions in Moravia, he was the patriarch who sent out St. Cyril and Methodius in 863. Because of that, they're suddenly encountering Frankish missionaries, and or I should say Latin missionaries, and they're noticing the appearance of this thing, and they're not very clear on what it is. And so St. Photius, who's very, very theologically astute, he jumps on it immediately. And so it was one of the pieces of, it was one of his sticking points. And at this time, and this is really, really important to realize, why is it that things blew up then? What was it about Ignatius, Saints Ignatius, Photius, this whole lot? Why is it that at that point in time, the lid blew off? And the reason is there were these things called the false decretals. They're commonly known as the pseudo-Isidore decretals or pseudo-Isidorian decretals. And there's different debates about when they were formulated. There's two schools of thought. There's the traditional one, and the main speaker or main promoter of that are Fuhrman and what's his name, Nibs. And then there's a sort of, I wouldn't say it's the new thought, as it's just a new strain running alongside of it, by a German scholar by the name of Ecke, E-C-K-E. And Ecke thinks that they were made sometime around the 820s, 830s. The traditional line of thought is that they were sometime in the, between 847, maybe early 850s. And it's four different corpuses of letters. The pseudo-Isidorians are just one part of that. There's also from someone named, I can't remember his name. It's Benedict the Deacon, I believe. And then there's a bunch of letters and such. And what these were meant to do was to expand the power of the papacy, but they were created in France or in Frankish Gaul, and it had to do with bishops being deposed really, really easily by the king. If the king didn't like what you said, he would just call a council and be like, hey, I need this guy deposed. Well, bishops will go, oh, okay, and they just depose the guy. And so it's not clear. Was it about Abbo of Reims, who was Louis the Pious went after him, or was it about Hincmar of Reims, who was an absolute tyrant, and his bishops were sick of his nonsense, and so they were looking for protection from him? It's not clear. But what they did, their solution to the problem, was to enhance the power of the papacy. If you could enhance the power of the papacy, and that it was the Pope who was in charge of depositions of bishops, and that no bishop could be deposed without him, that he could, without appeal, open the case of any bishop, that he could retry them himself, well, all of a sudden you make the bishops essentially immune from the synods that the kings call. And the very first bishop, or very first pope, who quotes these, in fact, he buys these hook, line, and sinker, is Nicholas I, the pope who's involved in the Photian schisms. He loves them. He's the first pope to quote them. We know that Hadrian II quotes from them over 30 times. And so it's really at that point that you start to see a divergence. And then they sort of die down for about a century when Rome is just in absolutely utter chaos. You have mafia families killing and then reinstalling popes. It's an absolute mess. And then these clerics from the Rhineland work their way into the papacy, and they start the Gregorian reforms. And they need something to justify their position. So what do? They go right to the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. All of those things you find in the Decretus Papae, all of them are found in the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. And this begs a question, right? I mean, you'll hear people like, what's his name? James Locutus. He'll say, like, well, with the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, for every one that's fake, there's 10 that are valid. He'll say stuff like that. I don't know if that's true. I don't think it is, because I've read a lot of canons, and I really don't see any canons that give Rome anything more than the right of appeals or the right of a review court. But the point is, if there were all these canons that gave Rome the type of powers that the First Vatican Council gives it, or even that the Gregorian reforms give it, why would you need to forge thousands of pages of material? If those canons already exist and they already spell it out, why would you go to it took years, and it took probably dozens of well-learned scribes to create these forgeries. So why would you go to all that work if the canons already make this point?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the reason is they don't.
They
don't make it at all. Yeah. I mean, why do you forge the deed to a house if you already own the house? If you already have the deed to the house, why forge one? I mean, can you imagine that? You come over to my house today.
He's just practicing forgery to use it against worse people. He's just practicing it. Okay, this is all a prank, man. Come on.
Oh, can you imagine? I come over to your house today and I'm like, David, what are you doing? It's like, well, I'm forging the title to my car. So, well, why? It's like, well, I just want a second copy. It's like, no. I mean, it takes a lot of time. And they really, really went in depth in these letters, because what they mostly do is they pull out existing segments from other letters and they put them together. They rearrange material and they put things together to make the claims look stronger. And then they add in additional material here and there. And so you have these really weird situations. It was they started to realize that something was, it was actually Hincmar of Reims who realized something was not quite right. But Hincmar also realized that he could use these to his advantage. So unlike St. Ignatius, who said, I didn't appeal, Hincmar just kind of kept his mouth shut and then, said, oh, I'll just use these anyway, If they're using them, I can use them against them. I'll just use them. But you have like Nicholas of Cusa, who was, I believe, present at the Council of Florence in the 1430s and 40s. I mean, he's like, I think there's something wrong. It was not until the 1600s that it was a Calvinist who proved definitively these are not real. You have popes from the 1st century quoting popes from the 4th century. These are not real at all. And no one had heard of these letters before the mid-800s anyway. And it was not until really the mid-1800s or late 1800s, I think, that you finally see everyone in the Roman Catholic world just go, okay, these are actual forgeries. They're not real at all. I mean, you had voices before that who were like, but it was maybe it was even late 1800s that finally everyone was on the same page with these being forgeries. So that's why this situation blew up at the time that it did, because people being deposed and replaced and appealing to Rome, that had happened again and again and again, and it had never blown up like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. What a scary world that is. If I had to try to defend that, I'd probably have a heart attack. I had heart attacks defending things that were veilless, but I want to kind of finalize this. The two things that are on my mind, actually 3 is going to be Palamite Synod, Matthew 16:18, classic, and the quote mines. But those last two are quite short. What have you done any research on the Palamite Synods, or is that something that you can comfortably talk about or not?
Not really.
All right, yeah, that could be a good conversation. The Hezekiah synods and like that, the history of that. That's definitely a because I think, and a lot of people seem to be on the point that if the Photian Council, if that's the eighth ecumenical council, the Palamite synods, the Hezekiah synods, those are like the ninth ecumenical. That's the ninth ecumenical council. Some people say that. I tend to agree. I think it makes sense to refer to them as such, but yeah, you, I don't even need to talk about this. This has become a meme. Matthew 16:18. What I want to ask you is this: how we view it, right? What we understand it is Peter the rock? Is it Christ? Is Christ the rock, or is the confession of Peter the rock, or is it all three of them simultaneously? What's the position that we have? You will say on that verse on Matthew 16:18.
Well, I mean, it's Peter. It's his confession. It's his faith. I mean, it's not. I mean, they treat it like it's a sort of like mic drop moment. So, well, no, it's not. I mean, we have all bishops are Peter. All bishops. We have a florilegium about this on the website it's called All Bishops Are Peter, and in the patristic writings, I mean, and even one of the quotes that we have is actually from the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Actually, I should make a note of it in there. But even up into the 800s when that was written, we also have a quote from Hincmar of Rheims. But even up until then, it was understood that all bishops were Peter. All bishops held the place of Peter. So this concept that Peter was a bishop and the other apostles were the presbyters was sort of a running thought in the back of everyone's heads. So I don't think that Matthew 16:18 is really this like mic drop moment. You see this great line from Saint Cyprian of Carthage, and it's in that Florilegium I just mentioned. He quotes Matthew 16:18, and then he immediately interprets it in terms of bishops.
Mm-hmm.
He says the church is founded upon bishops.
Mm-hmm. So it will be, I think the best way to describe it so that Roman Catholics can understand is to say that Peter is the first bishop. The office of Peter is really the office of the bishop. And that's kind of like the logic behind all bishops are Peter.
Right.
And that's the Petrine primacy, essentially, is that Peter is the first bishop. And so everyone after him that becomes a bishop is a type of Peter, you could say. It's not just the Pope. So you don't reduce it to just one office. It's actually the entirety. So in a way, you can say that for us, Peter is even more significant than what Roman Catholics think about him. Because for Roman Catholics, it's just one office. For us, Peter is the type of a bishop, or earthly bishop, you could say. You can say the type of a God the Father is a bishop. You can say that. But what I'm getting as the type of a material bishop, a person, a human person that's a bishop, it will be Peter. Will that be a correct interpretation, basically?
Yeah, you could say that. It's that the Bishop of Rome, he is in the see of Peter, but that does not preclude anyone else from having their lineage from Peter. The Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Alexandria, the bishops of numerous other places that St. Peter was a missionary in, such as, for example, Corinth, Caesarea, Lydia, all these areas, they have their lineage, if the New Testament is to be trusted, that Peter started communities there. They have their lineage from St. Peter.
Yeah.
And here's another thing. If it's that, some ask, do you think that Rome is first because of its civil status or because of its lineage from St. Peter? I think both. I think both. I don't think it's one or the other. Though we know that they were absolutely fine with doing some very creative work with that, such as saying, let's see, Peter was at Antioch, and Peter was never at Alexandria, but one of his disciples was, and then he died at Rome. Okay, the see where he never was, but his disciple was, will be second, and the see where he was bishop will be third. So, I mean, it doesn't really make sense, right? And then all these communities where he starts them, in person, are just not even on the map. What? But I mean, I think it's both. Can I correct myself on something? I just recalled something. It was not Saint Tarasius whom Saint Theodore the Studite had an issue with. I think he might have actually been ordained by Tarasius. I'm not sure. It was Nikephoros, and the issue that and Nikephoros was of the party that was very strongly pushing the Second Council of Nicaea. They were very much in the same vein as Saint Tarasius, and there's actually a very good book on this that if any listener emails me, the email's on the website. I'll send you a PDF of it, but I apologize. This PDF is also like a photocopy that was then scanned, and it's called, I believe it's the Ecclesiology of Saint Nikephoros of Constantinople. I'm not sure, but it's very, very good, and it discusses Saint Theodore the Studite as well, and how their concept of an ecumenical council was really the typical Byzantine one. It was the entire church there. It was the patriarchs, recognizing it. There's even a quote from Saint Nicephorus saying, you have your 5 patriarchs there. That's what makes a council ecumenical. But it had to do with Nicephorus. He was elevated from the status as a layman. That's what made me confuse Tarasius and Nicephorus. They were both elevated directly from laymen. Or not directly, but they were elected and then rapidly, much like St. Photius. Which, by the way, that was one of the reasons Rome had an issue with St. Photius, is he was chosen as patriarch and then rapidly moved through the ranks. I think it was 1 rank per day. Well, it was the same with St. Tarasius, and it was the same with St. Nicephoros. So it's, Rome is very particular about which canons it decides to apply and when. In fact, they're just as particular about it as we are, right? They're just as choosy about it as we are. So there's no high ground on that one for them.
Yeah. It's a classic thing that happens, but I think it feels like, it seems like it should be us that should be citing Matthew 16:18 in a sense. I mean, because as one listener pointed out, it's not even about Peter, because if it was about Petrine seats, then Antioch, I mean, isn't that also a Petrine seat? So it's not even about Peter himself, it's about the city of Rome in some weird sense. So when you investigate it in that way, it's even stranger, the Roman Catholic view, because at least, we can say, it is Peter, like, even if we said only, like, it's the only interpretation, let's say for the sake of argument that we said, oh, it's only Peter that's the rock. Like, that's the only interpretation, not the confession, not merely that confession, not Christ, but just Peter. It will still, be cogent. But the Roman Catholic view, they will go from Peter to seat of Rome and then throw Peter out and only use him as like a mascot. Like, hey guys, I'm the guy with the keys, kind of whereas we will say every single bishop is Peter, is a type of Peter, and that's kind of I think a huge thing that some people are missing out on, I guess. But
so they were very liberal in how they applied Matthew 16:18. There's a point in the Second Council of Constantinople, I think it is. Well, no, might have been Second Constantinople, might have been Third Constantinople, where just out of the blue they decide to apply it to the city of Constantinople. If you want, they're just like, the gates of Hades will never prevail. Like, Constantinople will never fall to the whatever group. They were. I mean, this idea that everyone went, oh, Matthew 16:18, the Pope. I mean, that is some hardcore Peter syndrome. And for those who don't know what Peter syndrome is, Peter syndrome is something that Catholics in general have, where
Yeah.
they assume that any mention of like a rock or infallibility or Rome or St. Peter or the Pope or keys, all of those are synonyms for each other. And they assume that all of those are also synonyms for infallibility of the Pope. They sort of put them all together. And you can see this when you read stuff they write. So they'll say, see, it says head, it says chief, infallibility. No, that's not what chief means. Well, it's what it means in this case. Okay, so then why does St. Athanasius, state that Antioch is it him or is it St. Basil who says it's the head church? Antioch is the head,
Basil.
St. Basil, there it is. These terms don't necessarily mean what they want them to, but if you're going to be, if you're going to be a Roman Catholic, you really need to assume that they are.
It's
I personally prefer the episcopate take on that passage than because the confession of faith one is like, yeah, I know, I think, what was it, there's a large amount of patristic support behind it, but like it's kind of, I don't know, it just makes more sense that the stability of the church would be rooted in the episcopate continuing on than it would be. I mean, like, the faith is important. I mean, every bishop needs to confess the correct faith, so it's kind of all together, but I always read that passage as having more of an emphasis on the episcopate than the faith.
Well, it's also, I mean, you look at bishops of Rome who are heretics, there's a lot of them, a lot. And the way that they get around this is they just say, well, they were anti-popes. You have, for example, Pope Liberius, who's actually a saint in the East because he repented, but he signed an Arian confession. They will say, well, it was under duress. Okay, so if someone holds a gun to my head and says, deny Christ, and I go, oh, okay, God forbid, I go, oh, okay, does that mean that I've committed no sin? No, of course not. You're expected to stand by Christ no matter what, gun to your head or not. Or you have like Felix, one of the Pope Felixes. He was a straight out Arian, and he was in there for years, and the Roman clergy accepted him. I mean, they had no issue with that. You have Pope Saint Vitalian, and again, he's a saint because he repented, but he made monothelitism the official stance of the Roman Church. We have a whole article about it on the blog. He quite literally abandoned. I mean, there's St. Maximus Confessor records how he's told by the imperial officials, an order has gone out from the patriarchs and from the Pope of Rome that anyone who does not accept the compromise we've reached shall be put to death. And St. Maximus doesn't say, oh, Rome would never do that. Nor does he say, oh, okay. He just goes, put me to death.
Yeah. I also want to add, because this is a possible counter-argument the Roman Catholic will use. They can because in Byzantine Christ, Demetrius Batrilus points out that St. Maximus did defend Honorius, but he then, I think either he or I came up with at the time, but I think the logic behind that was that St. Maximus was just trying to find some, it was more like, in some sense, practical what he was doing. He was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt instead of going, what are you doing? But nevertheless, I mean, with Pope Honorius is a classic example of why Vatican I is not true, I will say.
Right.
But
and he's writing an official letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople
when
he endorses monoenergism. But I mean, you are right.
Called? What was this document called? Is it Cephos or Ekphesis? I think it was, or it was both of them are Patriarch searches. I don't remember.
So you cut out for a second. Could you repeat that, please?
Do you remember the name of the document that Pope Honorius gave? There's multiple different documents with
the Ekphesis came out I believe after he died. The thesis was
Okay.
638. I was probably the Cephos. And at first, St. Maximus defends the Cephos. And Sophronius of Jerusalem does too. And then they realize that it's really just a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
And they then renounce it. But there's several documents that come out. We have an article on St. Maximus, but where we detail it. But St. Maximus takes up this fairly absurd and desperate situation wherein he attempts to state that Pope Honorius had never even stated one energy. He tried to claim that it was inserted into the letter.
Yeah.
No, that it was inserted into the letter, he tried to state.
Okay.
So he was desperate. And it was, unironically, it was actually Jerusalem that was the one patriarchal see that never fell. It was Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Because St. Sophronius dies in 638. That's the same year that Honorius dies. It's the same year that Sergius of Constantinople dies. And the See of Jerusalem is empty at least until 681 and possibly 692. So it's, I mean, you know, God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, definitely. And trying to make a formulation of that doesn't work all the time. Like hyper detailed formulation, I think, is a better way. But I think this stream we covered a lot already. I think there's some questions that we can answer. So I think we can make this section a question and answer. Lewis, you're the only one that's logged in my account, so I guess you can pull the stuff on here. But there's
I'll
a
scroll
question
through, but
by Nonno Lol, who
can I ask
asked,
a question real quick first?
Yeah, go on.
It's kind of a contemporary issue.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that the reason why we find it so difficult to get a Pan-Orthodox council together at the moment isn't so much because we don't have a pope, but more so because we have so many patriarchs?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
What's your
no.
take?
Clank. Me?
Well, both of you, like, why do you think it's so difficult to get a council together?
Because we don't have an emperor.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
But
unironically, I think that.
But we were calling Pan-Orthodox councils post-emperor.
The only one that I know of, well, the only, we could say the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. And a lot of these were easy to call because all of the patriarchs spent most of their time, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of them spent most of their time in Constantinople. The Ottomans demanded they did because it was easiest to keep an eye on them there.
Yeah.
Early on, though. No, you first.
It's kind of the same today. I mean, like Archbishop Petrus is from Bursa. But like, I've never heard anything about what he did in Bursa at all. That's like a good example, even today. Yeah, he's probably still doing stuff in Constantinople when he was in Bursa. Maybe I'm wrong, but we have a question here. But I definitely agree. Like, I think even back then you could say Russia, right? But I think, and some people might disagree, but when you don't have a secular government official, or like secular in the sense that he's on the government, doesn't hold an ecclesial throne, just head of government, head of state. When you don't have that guy who's a Christian who can like tell bishops, look, you're acting a little bit strange. I'm going to fix you. Go to this council and we can fix it out. When you don't have that like you used to have, it does create contemporary issues that I've noticed right now. Like, the way some of our bishops act, I don't think they could have acted that way if they lived in the 6th century. I think if the emperor will basically say, "Okay, look, come here. We're gonna fix you. I'm gonna put you in the seat with a bunch of other bishops, and you're gonna sort this out. Or if you don't, stuff's not gonna be nice for you." I mean, emperors could do that. Even emperors that have favorites could do that to their favorite bishops.
Well, yeah, you
Which
see
is
that
different.
at the First Council of Ephesus, where
Yeah.
the Emperor Theodosius II, he orders it. And like all of the councils, not only do they order it, they pay for it.
Yeah.
And that's a huge issue. If you're going to keep a bunch of people with their retinues together for 4 or 5 months, can you imagine, as they all slowly gather, as they make their way there? This was not taking a plane or a boat. This was overland journeys that could take months.
Yeah.
Coming by sea was, I mean, extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. And so he's paying for everything. He's paying for their lodgings on the way there, their lodgings when they get there, their lodgings when they come back, their food, and everything. So the idea that, you know,
better times.
I mean, look. Yeah, there were. Yeah, some say it was a better time, but I mean, you look at like the Lateran Council of 649. The Pope calls it. He tries to make it an ecumenical council. Hardly anyone shows up.
Yeah.
In fact, it is so poorly attended that they have to dig up letters from years before and try to present them as though they were written to the council. In one case, at least, I think they actually dug up a letter from a bishop who had been dead for several years, and they knew it. I would have to look that up again, but I mean, they were desperate to look like they were in control of the situation.
If he was alive, he will attend the council. Trust me, guys. I'm the source of it. I know.
He's here in spirit. So I mean, they're pulling up stuff from like really far afield. In fact, they even pull up a letter. Here's an even better one. They even pull up a letter from I believe it's Sergius of Cyprus, I want to say. They pull up this letter and they read it from him. And I think it was right around that time he actually sided with the Monothelites. But they use this old letter of his to try and look like, you know, we really got it going on. People, you know, they really want to hang out with us. So there were attempts at this, and it didn't really work out. But even then, with the Pope calling the shots, supposedly, I mean, he could hardly get anyone there. Look at the Council of Beza and Constance, when I mean you have rival councils. And by the way, if you read Joseph Gill's The Council of Florence, which is a book as biased as it is long, even he points out that the Pope just seemed to have absolutely no control over what was going on at Basel. And it was purely the fact that his ships got to Constantinople before the ships of the Council of Basel. It was that alone that got the Greek legates to come to the Papal Council. Because the Greeks had been in negotiations with both of them.
Yeah, the original plan was Council of Basel. I remember reading about that. That was the original plan, and then stuff started to happen. And at the time, even at the Council of Florence, I believe there was a Council of Basel, and there was a schism going on in Rome at the same time. So multiple different kings of like big kingdoms were in schism with Rome at the time. I think Aragon and Castile were both, I believe. Some other kingdoms in Western Europe, they were like in schism with Rome because they were taking the side of Council of Basel. I remember exactly who, but there were like relevant kingdoms that were in schism because of that, if I remember correctly.
You know, people make entire careers based on commenting upon the Western Schism.
Yeah.
It is that complicated. I mean, 3 different lines of popes at one time, and which line is the real one? In fact, the Catholic Church had flip-flopped on it, which was the real line. And they flip-flopped on it until Pope John the 23rd, the Pope who called the Second Vatican Council. He took the name John the 23rd, replacing the previous John the 23rd, and thereby leaving only one line of popes as a valid popes. And that line of popes that were the valid popes were the initial ones, with the guy who was a nut job, who was probably bipolar or something, maybe paranoid, schizophrenic. I mean, he was nuts.
He will be a TikTok star if you live today.
Oh yeah, he was all over the place. But it was that line of popes, but they'd flip-flopped on. Of course, the problem is that at a certain point, the College of Cardinals became completely diluted with a bunch of cardinals who were appointed by anti-popes. So those cardinals are not real cardinals. So here we go. You have the real cardinals electing an anti-pope. The anti-popes then appoint anti-cardinals, you could say. The anti-cardinals then appoint a real pope. How does that work?
I don't know.
I don't know.
How does that work? Yeah.
Apparently being a real cardinal doesn't matter, apparently.
And wasn't the Western Schism solved by... this kind of turned into a trashing of Roman Catholicism, but wasn't the Western Schism solved by like the three popes had a council and they elected another pope? Wasn't that solved by that? That's what I remember.
It was like they held a council and they tried to get two of them to... oh geez, I'd have to review it. It's so complex. I think it was they got two of them to agree to resign, but would not say which was the real pope. They had to kind of, I mean, you get the impression it was like toddlers throwing temper tantrums. Like, yes, the Snickers bar really is yours. I'm just, as daddy, I'm going to eat it, and therefore neither of you will get it, right? I mean, it's kind of that situation. Like, you can't, I mean, there's no like cutting the candy bar in half and giving them half. It's like, well, you can be pope, January through June, and you can be pope July through December, right? You can have half the mitre, right? No, there was nothing like that. So they had to basically just coddle both of their feelings.
Yeah, they elected Pope Martin V, and he was not one of the contenders.
It's such a mess. But they and Martin V, by the way, was in communication with the Greeks. This idea that just like out of the blue, the Byzantines like wanted union with Rome, they were always playing that game. One of the emperors told his son, look, always make the Turks and the Catholics think you want union and then stall. Because as long as I can't remember which one it was, because as long as the Ottomans, as long as the Ottomans think that you're about to join into union with the West, they'll step back. As long as the Catholics think you're about to join into union with the Catholics, they'll give military aid. Just stall those, stall endlessly. It's like that saying goes, sing to evil and stay far away, So, I mean, they could really, really milk a situation. There's a question here from someone named Vladimir the Red Sun. It says, about the Patriarch of Constantinople, Florence, since popular acclamation is necessary for consecrations, can we say that Gennadios was not Patriarch at the time of Florence? Gennadios became Patriarch after the Ottoman conquest of the city in 1453. So he was not Patriarch at all at that time.
Yeah. That's what I remember as well. Maybe I remember Gennadius that was relevant in that time. Who was the first to exegete Matthew 16 as support of the papacy? Do you know, Yubi?
I have no clue. I there's so much. I mean, there's so many writers at the time. I don't know. Ask Eric Ibarra. He would love to filibuster about that for 3 hours.
Yeah. Well, you see, it's not.
Well, that's why I offered him a minute and a half to my minute, because it would take him 2 minutes to do what I could do in 1 minute. So I would still be ahead if I gave him a minute.
Yeah. So actually,
no,
you need to equalize it by giving 2 minutes. Yeah. I know. But,
by the way, that offer is always open. That offer's
Yeah.
open to anyone.
It's always open. It's always open. The truth shall set you free, unless you're, I don't know. That's for a different video I'm gonna make. I'm gonna comment on that in a different video. But the same person asks, an argument made against the doctrine of the papacy is that it divides the heavenly church from that of the earthly church, unless we say that the pope is the head of the heavenly church as well. Would you agree with this argument?
No.
Why not? Like, as in, like, is it a
I
good
don't-
argument? Is it a bad argument?
I think it's a bad argument. I think it's poorly constructed to begin with, because there's always an intermediary, right?
Yeah.
If it's not going to be the Pope, it'll be the bishop. So
Yeah.
this idea of like, well, the Pope is not the head because Jesus Christ is a head. Well, the head in what sense?
Yeah.
And if the Pope isn't the head, you have other heads or another head. I mean, it's yeah. How do Latins respond to this? Probably by quoting Matthew 16:18 at the top of their lungs. You notice that, right? You notice that they, you go, well, what about this and that? They're like, well, Jesus says, I will build my church upon this. It's like, yes, we know, we understand. They just can't. I mean, to them, that is so tied. It's that Peter syndrome. It is so tied in their minds to infallibility, to universal ordinary jurisdiction, to all of these things, that for them it's a synonym.
You'd think that, they make so many apologetic against Protestants. They say you can't just interpret the Bible on your own like that. You'd think that they will get the message that they send themselves, but they don't seem to understand that they can't play the Protestant game themselves. Because that's what they're really doing at the end of the day. They're not appealing to tradition. They're not appealing. They're just saying Matthew 16:18. It's like it reminds me of one of the Calvinist guys, the bald one. I forgot his name, but he will always say James White. Yeah, his in his debate with Trent Horn, his main line always was the same thing. His main line that he taught all the time was, well, can God fail giving salvation? Well, no. That's why I believe in eternal security. That's why monergism is true, because God can't fail in what he tries to do, and God is trying his if he says you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved, and that doesn't matter what you think. It's like these slogans. It's like the slogan that it's no different than the Matthew 16:18 slogan, from my experience.
Well,
at least.
It's not quite that they're just, it's that they're viewing the tradition through a later tradition.
Yeah.
And they have and they have a very, very hard time taking off that Peter syndrome lens. And by the way, once you take that off, the house of cards falls rapidly. I mean, rapidly. And so there's a reason why they're so resistant to take that lens off. Yeah. But there's no going back at that point. Let's see, we have another question here. Do you mind if I read it?
Yes, you read it.
The more important question is, how do we understand Peter's authority in general? We don't doubt that Peter was a chief apostle, as far as I know. Well, yes, he was a chief, he was a head. So what is the authority? Well, I mean, all bishops are Peter, yes. Or, for example, like with popes, what was the role of the Pope in the Synod? The role of the Pope was as the head of the Synod. He was to the patriarchs, an archbishop to the patriarchs. That's why they say, the Council of Chalcedon, they call him the Archbishop of the world, or the ecumenical archbishop, the term that they use. And so this gets into another point that I should have brought up earlier, but I was having a very good time chatting with you, so it kind of slipped my mind. There were Latin terms. There were 3 of them that are very, very, very important to know. Okay, yeah. One is imperium. Imperium meant these were all words for authority. Imperium, potestas, and auctoritas. Okay. Mm-hmm. Auctoritas, it meant sort of like I'd mentioned, it meant like a authority in the sense of a leading authority. That was the main meaning for it. There were a variety of others. Mm-hmm. Potestas meant a legally binding authority. It meant that you could tell someone what to do, right? And then imperium was that you could use military force against someone, right? So imperium is military authority, potestas is legal authority, and auctoritas is social authority, you could say. Now, the Romans ended up taking this very nuanced view of auctoritas, and it was a very specific Roman term, to the point that when the biography of Augustus Caesar was translated into Greek early on, the translator made a note saying the Romans have this word auctoritas. There's really no way to translate it into Greek. You can't translate it as, say, like exousia or, arche, or no. It's a very specific Roman word. So what was it about this Roman word? What else did it mean? Okay, so it might, one, like your reputation, your clout, right? Cicero, the great Cicero, says about Octavian, he's very, he doesn't have auctoritas yet. He's still too young for that, right? But it also meant, if you think about it in terms of your reputation, if you are in a court case, you have to call into question the reputation of the witnesses. A witness with a good reputation is a good witness. Whereas if they have a history of lying, well, they're a horrible witness. You cannot use them. Yeah. And so the term auctoritas then took on the meaning of a witness. Okay. From there, later on, Christian writers start to use the term auctoritas to refer to biblical texts, because those texts are a witness to the events.
Yeah.
Okay. Later on, they also start to use the term auctoritas to refer to a deed, to a piece of land, because that deed is a witness to the fact that you own it. The Romans also used it to refer to the right to ratify something or to authorize something. And this is how you see the popes use it. They typically use it in terms of authorization. When they talk about their authority, by the authority, they're saying, they're using the term auctoritas, right? And they're using it to mean like authorization. Now, the difference between auctoritas and potestas was that auctoritas, it acted like a gatekeeper. It could say yes or no to you coming in. Right?
Yeah.
Potestas is what made you a king. Potestas is what could what could allow you to say you will go in or you will go out. Auctoritas just said whether or not you could come in or could go out. Do you see? One is much more passive, one is active. The authority they had was a passive authority. And it's the same authority that a head has within their synod, a patriarch has within their synod. I mean, the Patriarch of Moscow can veto the decisions of the synod. There's no debate about that. Right? So that then gets into the other question about Canon 28. Leo annuls it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, except they had used the third canon of Constantinople,
which is the same thing.
Which is the same thing. They had it in the Western collections previous to this. They had accepted Constantinople's second rank via councils they had held previous to that, starting in the, I think it was 390s, I want to say. And there were Roman legates of these, and they saw the seating order, and they were fine with it. And also at Chalcedon, there's this moment where one of the papal legates says, why was St. Flavian of Constantinople not accorded his correct place?
Yep.
Why was he not in second place? And one of the bishops says, in astonishment, you know the canons. There's only one canon that could be saying that, and that's the third canon of Constantinople. There's only one. So they did very much accept it. And then when it was pushed into their faces as a 28th canon, they tried to backpedal. So it wasn't that Leo could not annul, or it's not that Leo annulled it. It's that Leo couldn't. It was already in effect. They had already accepted it.
And you
It
can't
wasn't
really
in the canon.
you have to accept either the whole council or none of the council. A lot of the bishops after Chalcedon kind of understood that, and they kind of
I wouldn't.
found Leo weird about it in a
I
sense.
would. I wouldn't say that. I mean, there's plenty of examples of bishops who they accepted this or that canon, or they, for example, the 28th canon, sort of out of respect for the Pope of Rome, I suppose, it really does not appear in Byzantine canonical literature until the Code of Justinian, even though they continue seating the Patriarch of Constantinople in second place. He continues hearing appeals.
Mm-hmm.
They just didn't add it into the law code. And it was not until I believe it was the 21st or 22nd canon of the Council of 869 where they say Constantinople holds second place.
Mm-hmm.
They admit it.
And there's also another thing to go from Roman Catholics to Orientals. I mean, if keeping the potestas thing in mind as well. I mean, no, auctoritas thing in mind. Sorry, the clout, right? What did Dioscorus do that's such a huge deal in Ephesus to him? Why is it such a huge deal? Well, because he got rid of second place. He got rid of first place. He got rid of fourth place, I believe. Antioch, Constantinople, Rome. He basically tried to say, I have enough clout to do these things, basically. And that's actually such a huge deal that you can't really do something like that without a good justification, and he didn't have any. That's kind of like another apologetic against Ephesus too that not many people really cover. I've noticed.
That's a very good point. That is, and this ties into Ephesus 1. One of the complaints of Saint Cyril against John of Antioch is Cyril said John has no right to excommunicate me whatsoever. And so there was a sort of pecking order, and this gets back to the honor culture. What rank do you have? That shows who you can excommunicate. So how then do you excommunicate a pope? Well, all of them basically gang up on him. But more so, in practice, though, in order to condemn a patriarch, you really had to have all of the patriarchs sign on to it.
Yeah.
To get a universally binding condemnation. Although patriarchs were constantly, condemning each other and, deposing each other, and that person was then considered a persona non grata within that patriarch's territory. I mean, when Dioscorus deposes all these figures at Ephesus 2, the depositions were considered valid enough that the first session of Chalcedon is dedicated to canonically reversing them. If they were truly invalid, they would have just said, well, they were invalid. I mean, you have, I want to say it's the 8th session, I believe, where Theodoret of Syre comes out, and the bishops go, you can't be here. And some go, well, the Pope, Pope Leo reversed the sentence. And they're a bunch of them like, no, he needs to condemn Nestorius. And here's a good point. Leo had no business restoring Dioscorus to a see, because, Theodoret to a see, because Theodoret had never fully accepted the Council of Ephesus.
Yeah.
He hadn't condemned Nestorius that I'm aware of. And that's why they made him do it in public.
Yeah.
He didn't want to condemn his friend.
So he had to accept the council that accepts Ephesus 1, in turn accepting Ephesus 1, and he had to condemn Nestorius, which he never did until that point. And still somehow Chalcedon is Nestorian if you listen to Orientals. But that's a different debate, I guess. But yeah, that's something that kind of like sidetracked me, because I saw Pope Saint Leo reversing that thing, and like, wait, he can do that? And I kind of thought he could for some reason, until I realized, that officially got recognized, you can say, because of Chalcedon. That's why Chalcedon was needed, which shows the necessity of the council.
Right. It was a trial of Dioscorus. That's why Dioscorus was not allowed to sit with the voters. I mean, they run two trials of him. One by the imperial official Anatolius. There's also the Patriarch Anatolius, but and then another by the papal legates. And what was I going to say?
Chalcedon, Ephesus 2, Anatolius.
Oh, I forgot where I was going with that.
I was going on. Yeah, but
you inspired me to say something, and then I interrupted myself.
But what was I getting at before you can think of it? But like what I was getting at here is that I would even go as far as to say that like that action alone, what Dioscorus did, I think signifies that our ecclesiology is even a bit different from the Oriental ecclesiology. So even in that regard, I don't think we can say we are the same because of that, because we do have this kind of understanding of, he's bishop. You can't really just treat him as a co-worker. It's more than that, right? Whereas it feels like if for their side, it's a bit of more of a co-worker. And of course, I do know that Dioscorus, he thought in his own mind that he was the second, because he didn't accept Constantinople 1. But I don't think that really matters because they accept Constantinople 1 as an ecumenical council a couple of years after Chalcedon. So which basically means they accept that they were wrong in that regard. But what I'm getting at is even in that regard, feels like we have a unique ecclesiology, even compared to the Church of the East or Orientals, even, I will say, because of these things when you historically look at them.
Well, if you ask Eric Ibarra, he thinks we're all one church, apparently.
Yeah.
Based on that was a hilarious video, by the way.
Yeah.
And his excuses were even funnier than his initial comment. His excuses in the comments were even funnier as he tried to back out of it. And I can kind of see what he's saying, but his issue is that he always has to be the smartest guy in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads him into sort of trying to make situations look more complicated than they are, so that he can then step in to be the sort of revealer of truths to you.
Mm-hmm.
And he can sort of show, so when you take that attitude, you end up in these really, really odd situations where you just end up looking like you're clueless.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
someone that think that we're the truth, like the Orientals, Assyrians, that we are the same church, like Timothy Flanders and Eric Ibarra, people like those should not call themselves apologists. What they should call themselves are circus clowns, because that's all they are. If you think you're an apologist and you make a basic mistake like that, honestly give up. Like you should wash dishes in a restaurant. That's what you should be doing, not apologetics.
Or go be a mathematician, or whatever you do. I mean, we're all specialized in something, even if it's just sitting around, playing video games. Someone specialized in something may or may not make money, but there's one point I want to bring out about the system of honor, right? That you have, first, second, third. Who can you excommunicate?
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Gill, in his book, The Council of Florence, he's a Catholic priest. He records how the papal representatives were horrified when the Easterners came and how they interacted with the Pope. And one of the really horrifying things to them was that the Patriarch of Constantinople referred to the Pope as my fellow brother bishop. Now, you see this term come up all the time. Bishops will, in patristic texts, will address the Pope as my brother or our fellow bishop or this or that. By the time of Florence, their ecclesiology had drifted so far away that it's like, no, he's not your brother bishop. He's your parent.
Yeah.
So every time you see the statement in patristic texts of our fellow minister Celestine, our fellow minister whatever, our brother bishop so-and-so, brothers, these, the Catholics will try to reinterpret these in terms of, like, oh, well, sacramentalism. No, that's not how they interpreted it at Florence. Not at all. They interpreted statements like that to be a downplaying of the Pope's role.
Yep. Florence will reject those things. Like if you start your letters, like the church fathers start the letters to Rome, today they will say, why are you treating me like I'm your equal? I'm not your equal. I'm more than you. Like, but to get back to the questions, question for Ubi: some Roman Catholics argue that canons 9 and 7 of Chalcedon granted primacy of Constantinople only in the East. The letter of the canons don't appear to limit it only to the East. Any thoughts?
Well, you have to read the commentaries on that. You do see a case with Saint Ambrose of Milan, who a bishop of his runs off, or a deacon of his runs off to Constantinople and ends up becoming the bishop of Nicomedia. And Ambrose appeals to the Patriarch of Constantinople to solve it. So, no, it's not limited only to the East. And there is the question about what do you do when people have appealed to both the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople. We have an example of this. During the pontificate of Pope St. Boniface in the early 400s, the situation blows up over the bishops in Illyria, which is in the Balkans. They were culturally Greeks, so they were culturally more in line with Constantinople, but they were under Rome, and the issue had started because the secular boundaries changed, and the patriarchates were, it seems, initially based on sort of the secular boundaries. Well, when the secular boundaries start to change, why not change the church boundaries with it, was sort of the attitude. It didn't always work out. Sometimes it got messy. And so these bishops appeal to the Pope, and then they turn around, they appeal to Constantinople. And the Pope just, he has a cow. He cannot believe that they've done this. And we have an article on it on Pope St. Boniface where it's all detailed, but in the end, it was more of sort of a gentleman's agreement as they smoothed it out.
Yeah, so that should answer the question. I'm sure I looked up other questions too. I think I
got most of them.
Craig asks, what do you think of the Greeks saying only the EP can convene a council? What is your opinion on that?
Who asks this?
Craig Trulia.
Only the EP can convene a council. Well, historically, the councils were convened by emperors, whether or not the EP wanted it. And up until the fall of the empire, it was that way. We do have.
I guess he means a Pan-Orthodox council, not just a normal council. Because if it was just a normal council, I don't think that will make any sense.
Moscow has tried to call one on a couple of occasions, and it did not work out. They do not have the auctoritas to push it through. Besides, who wants to go to Russia? It's just so cold and depressing. I like snow, but that much snow. I can take a month of it, and that's but yeah.
That should answer the question. Another question that I remember, but I think it was about what primacy is overall, but I think we answered that already in the beginning, like what primacy is, what it means. So I don't think there's any more questions. So maybe we should just wrap it up. We've been going on for 2 hours. That's already a lot. Do you still have energy in you for more, or should we just cover it up, Louis, Ubi?
If there's more that needs to be done, there's energy in me for more.
Yeah.
I don't see anything else.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any more comments. So I think we can basically wrap it up. But this was pretty good. I liked it. We covered some good history. This starts from like how do we view the papacy to epistemology to just like ecumenical council history, which is still great. It's pretty good. Good content. And I think this is relevant contemporarily speaking, because a lot of the examples from the past apply to the present, I think.
Of
Like,
course.
yeah. And I think it helps a lot of people understand more what was going on in the past and how it applies to the present. So I think this is just pretty good overall. So thank you, B. Follow him on YouTube. I can't wait for your next video whenever it's gonna come out. He has a blog. I think it will be linked in the description below if it isn't already. I'll definitely link it. But I'm gonna be shilling Ubi. Good content. Basically, and I don't say this just to praise, but from an Orthodox perspective, it's the best content you can find online when it comes to the papacy. It's straight up the best.
Oh, you're too
Compared to other
kind.
content. Compared to other contents, it's more like he makes them look a bit baby tier. I'll go as far as
Oh,
to say.
you're too
Yeah.
kind. By the way, I've been listening to your videos lately at work. I really enjoy them. They're very, very
Thanks.
edifying. I liked your one on St. Maximus specifically. That was very good. And your series on Orthodox Christology was very good as well. Very, very good.
Thank you. We gotta use the nerd energy that we have to help
Yeah,
people.
yes.
That's
It's a
basically what.
synergy.
Yeah, definitely.
We do have some more videos coming out. Hopefully, we can get 2 or 3 more out before the end of the year. But I mean, to make a video like that first one we did takes a tremendous amount of effort.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to write a script. You know, Lewis spent all this time turning them into, putting quotations on the screen and videos. We had a narrator. I mean, there's a lot of reading that goes into it. The writing part itself is, fairly minimal, but we're about 90% done on a script. I'm not going to say what it's about because I like to keep it a surprise, but I'm now doing the reading for another one as I finish up that first one. And then I have a third one in mind. Hopefully, I can get all 3 of those out this year. But the goal is to be able to do a video once every 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
So,
And like compared to what I do, I just make PowerPoint slides, man. I don't really do much. I just PowerPoint slides to talk over. But
I like it.
yeah, they work.
I like them.
They're
I
simple.
learn a
They
lot
work.
from them.
So that will be it for the stream. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for coming, Ubi, for spending time with us.
Oh, thank you
Something
for
I
having
wanted
me.
to
It's been a pleasure.
definitely pleasure's mine. Thank you, Lewis, for being our streamer, because I'm not the one streaming. He's streaming it on my channel because I don't have good internet. So thank you, Lewis, for being our male model for the stream. Definitely we should.
I'm flattered.
Yeah, we should. If there's anything more we can talk about, definitely we should do this more. And yeah, that's it. So thank you all for watching. God be with you all. And check out
We'll put a
Ubi's
link to
blog.
Ubi's blog in the description.
Yeah, we'll put it in the description. It'll be in the description, 100%. So
thank you. All right.
Lewis, you can close the stream because I'm not on my
And
account.